Hey everyone, it's time to talk about one of the most annoying tasks there is in modeling toon characters, and that is dealing with anime or toon mesh hair. I've tried a lot of techniques for this over the years, and I must inform you that none of them are intuitive or easy or convenient. It's just not something that there's a good one-step workflow for. Unlike particle hair, which has had lots of development over the years and is quite easy to work with. But I'm getting results I'm pretty happy with, and I found a workflow that is significantly less obnoxious than all the others I've tried. What we're looking at here is the hair from my previous Ray project, and this tutorial will go over how this is made. The main problem when modeling anime or toon hair is that you need clean and even topology, because if you put toon shaders on something, it will show every flaw in your topology. And you also need there to be very little intersections because that won't play well with line art, pretty much any method of creating line art. So you need to keep things ordered and under control, and most of the regular methods for modeling hair don't work very well with that. The most common method for modeling hair in Blender is to do curve modeling. There's a million tutorials on how to do it, there's lots of different styles. But what most of them boil down to is you'll have a Bezier curve like this, you'll have a bevel object, then you'll spend a lot of time duplicating the curve, adjusting it, and slowly model your hair. And maybe you'll use particle hair and convert them to curves, it's basically the same result. Maybe you'll make multiple curve objects with different bevel profiles. There's some really great add-ons for doing this. But the problem with this style is that the curve objects are going to be pretty uniform, and you're going to have a lot of intersections if you built up a proper, clump shape. Then your topology is a mess. You'll have all these bits that will pick up bad line art, and that will show up as self-shadowing sections in a toon shader. If you use a really simple flat toon tone shader, you can get away with it, but it's not ideal even then. And usually what people do is merge these together with sculpt mode or dynamic topology. They'll boolean them together and then try to clean them up, but then it's high poly and you have to retopologize it, which is hard on a strandy, sharp edge shape, and it's hard to get a clean UV unwrap for it. And so even though it's quick for the initial setup, it's very time consuming to actually get clean results and get to nice clean topology. So it's a great workflow for concepting, especially if you pick up some of the add-ons like Hair Tool, or I think there's one called Amasawa, or something like that. So it's great for concepting, but it's not actually good for the final product. Then another common style you'll see is just long-form modeling by hand. You'll often start with a sphere or something, maybe UV unwrapped, and then you'll rip vertices, or get your proportional editing and start making your shapes, and just hand model everything. You can add some loop cuts, cut some bits out, whatever, and slowly over time, again, you build up the shape of the hair you want. And this lets you have better control of the topology, but in a workflow like this, it's hard to do layers of strands, or to it's just all very slow and fiddly, because you're basically going to manually position every single vertex by hand in the right place. And I've done it, it's slow, it drives you nuts after a bit. It's not fun to work with, and it's not scalable. If you want to make more complex hair, it just takes exponentially longer. So it'll get you good results in the end, but it's about the slowest path you can tread. So the method I prefer to work with at this point is similar to mesh modeling, but using a bunch of modifiers to make the process easier. I call this the flat modeling technique because you model it flat, and then you wrap it onto the head with modifiers. Got the back and the front flat. And then for some of these side pieces, these are modeled as clumps and then attached with the curve modifier. So the nice thing about this technique is all my topology is flat, so it's easy to work with. It's still hand editing, But you basically start with a clump and then you duplicate it a bunch, you adjust the sizes, but you're able to keep all the topology lined up. Then unhide the modifiers here. Got a bunch of lattices. This lattice is controlling this hair, and it gets curved onto the head with a curve modifier, then wrapped into a semicircle with a simple deform, and then I adjust it further with this other tweak lattice. And these bits on the side of the head here are attached to curves, so I can adjust them easily. So it basically breaks down the tedious modeling into a bunch of easily repeatable steps. It's a lot of steps, but all of them, you can tell what you're supposed to be doing next. You can see it easily. You can use axis locking when modeling, so it's easy to adjust stuff with proportional editing, and then it's not hard to join all your strands together. For this tutorial video, I have speed modeled a new demo setup of the hair. The first part of the tutorial is showing the setup of the lattice and modifiers, and the basics of how to plan out the bangs, from starting off with getting some basic clumps, joining them together into more advanced shapes, and then there is a time lapse of refining it all the way up to the fully finished hair with proportional editing, figuring out your edges for crease, and then finally joining the whole thing together into the completed hair. Let's start with the basics. Blender has many tools that can be used to bend or twist shapes, and we're going to look at two of them, which we'll use for this setup. There are other ways this could be done, but these are the ones I like to work with. The first we're going to look at is the curve modifier. We've got here a curve and a test plane. This curve is a simple Bezier curve that I've aligned down the front of the face, as this will be used to define the angle of our bangs in the front. I've given it some extrude and bevel just to make it more easy to see, but it won't actually be rendered in the end. The curve modifier is put on geometry to map it down a curve. There we go. Our plane's on the curve, but is it in the right orientation? We can take a look by tabbing into edit mode and setting it to display both the default state and the modified state. And if we go and grab our top right corner and move it back and forth, we can actually see that that is affecting our bottom left corner, which isn't what we want. We want our top right corner to still be in the top right. So let's try different deformation axes. Turns out that Z minus is the one we want. I'm not going to try to explain exactly how all these axes work. You can look into these modifiers in more detail if you like. So, the important thing to know, though, is that the origin point of both objects matters a lot. We can see here that our plane's origin point is in the middle, and the curve's origin point is actually in the middle as well. And you have to keep those origin points lined up, because that's what is used to define how far the curve moves. We re-enable the curve modifier, and then move the curve in object mode, it messes things up because it's disaligning their origin points. But if we move it in edit mode, the mesh stays properly on the curve because it's keeping a consistent offset. If we, of course, move the plane's origin point, that will adjust where exactly on the curve it appears, so it is okay to move its origin point. But we can get the same effect by moving the mesh in edit mode within the object, and that's generally what I prefer to do. Since I want the curve to define where my front bangs end at the top, I actually want to adjust this top loop be down at the origin point of the curve. And you can eyeball that with a motion, or if you want, you can snap your cursor, set the origin point of the plane to the top, and then set the cursor back to the curve, and snap the plane to the cursor. Now, we could start at the beginning of the curve and end at the end. We've got a bit more geometry than we need on this test plane, because it's so large. But we won't remove it just yet. Next, let's look at the other modifiers. The simple deform modifier is used to apply a non-destructive transform to a mesh. We can twist, bend, taper, or stretch. In our case, we want bend. We can control the angle, with the pivot point being the object origin. We can control the axis it's going to bend around, and we can control the amount it's going to bend. Difficult to see this one. I can make it affect only one side or another. In our case, we're going to use this to bend this plane into a semicircle. And what can help us with that is the other option, which is that we can add an empty to serve as the pivot point. Get one. Define it. Now see that it's trying to bend around the empty's origin instead, which only does anything on the axis it bends on. Let's go ahead and combine this with our previous curve modifier, which is bending it one way. Now let's take this empty on, and by adjusting this empty, we can get this to bend in the way we like, although we're going to need more of an angle if we're going to wrap this all the way around the head to be bangs. Moving the empty back and forth controls how wide it is, and then the angle controls how curved it is. So 200 is about a good number. But now we can see that the front profile is being defined by our curve, and of course edit. And the rest is being defined by the simple deform. Now it's worth observing, as I move these points, it is going to change the shape because the curve modifier is acting before the simple deform. And the simple deform is bending the whole mesh around this pivot point. So if the mesh changes size, then the shape of the bend is going to change as well. Now, this doesn't go all the way to the top at the moment, so at this point I can tab back into the mesh, and if I move it up on Z, then it'll close in at the top, and we can get the decent shape for our front bangs. And now you can see what we've been working towards with the setup, where our mesh is actually flat still, but then these modifiers have bent it around our forehead into a decent anime bangs shape. We can, of course, make adjustments now to try to get this to properly fit the head and lock in the full shape we want. And we can probably trim some of these bottom loops off. Not going to need that many, but I'm going to leave plenty of space. However, if we do make changes, such as scaling this, then that changes the overall size of the shape, and then we'd have to readjust these objects to get to the exact size we want. But let's not spend too much time on that yet, because there are more layers of this setup. Let's add a tweak lattice. If you're not familiar with what lattices do, you should pause and go look up a bigger tutorial on them, because I'm only going to show the bare minimum. But essentially, a lattice is used to adjust or distort the object inside. So if we add a lattice modifier here, and then move the lattice's points in edit mode, it will distort the mesh inside. And, of course, we can control how many subdivides there are in the lattice. So if we weren't exactly happy with our base shape here, it's pretty easy to set up a lattice and then use it just to adjust this shape. Make it fatter or thinner. It's a good idea when working with a lattice to work in a shape key so that it's easier to revert to the start. That way, if I make some change and they decide I don't like it, then I can just toggle it on and off or just delete it entirely. But before we set up this lattice, there's actually a whole other layer of lattices to do. Let's turn these modifiers off to get back to our default shape and add another lattice here. We'll scale it in object mode so it roughly fits the bounds of the hair we want. It can be pretty much any thickness. I'll do about that. I'll let it be a little bit larger than this. Then I will add a lot of subdivision. We probably only need 1 or 2 there. And we're going to try to have it be a fairly even grid. And now, instead of these modifiers being on this plane, I'm going to transfer them to the lattice. I'm going to pause and do that. All right. Our plane is now inside the main lattice. That's affecting it. We've given it about as many subdivisions as the plane has, although we could add more if we need more precision. Remove these from the plane. Now the lattice has the curve, and then the simple deform, and then also the other lattice is acting on the first lattice. So it's lattices on lattices. And if we needed more ways to tweak this, we could add even more. I've also gone and named my objects clearly. I'm going to hide the tweak lattice for now. So, now that we have this set up, we can actually chuck pretty much anything inside this lattice. And that is what we will use to make our hair. Before we move to actually building the hair itself, let's look at a couple other options in our arsenal. This lattice trick gives us a way to make shapes that are formed by wrapping something. That could be good for front bangs, ponytails, or even twin tails in the back. Lots of shapes in anime or toon hair can be broken down to essentially half or quarter circles. We can edit our plane more by removing loops or whatever to get a block in. We could set it up with mirror modifiers or whatever other modeling tool we wanted. And of course, we could edit the mesh inside the lattice and see what that's doing. Now, if we make major movements, that will be distorted by all these different modifiers wrapping it. Generally, when using this method, I try to avoid doing too much editing by hand, because part of the point of this being non-destructive is that you can fully return to the flattened state. But there are some things that this method isn't good for, and that is long strands. So we're going to set ourselves up with a different method to do those. And that is another way of using the curve modifier. Let's turn off our bangs plane. And I'm going to unhide some other curves that I've already made. These are also Bezier curves, and they are for strands down the sides of the face. Let's make sure we're at their origin point, which I've set to be the same as for other things, but we could actually move somewhere else. And let's quickly get ourselves a cylinder. This will also just be a placeholder block in, so top. Oops. Scale it in a bit more. And we can turn on proportional editing, taper the bottom. And now, flatten it on Y. Pretty decent block and shape. Now we can give it a curve modifier and get on here. Stretch it to the right size. And just so it doesn't conflict with the other block in when I have this all the way open, let's move it to the left side, which of course messes up the curve modifier. So I'm going to go ahead and move the curve modifier, the curve object's origin to match. And now it works again. And we can duplicate that and do this one to the other side. Have to do the same thing with object origins. I messed. Don't miss buttons. And there we go. Now we have side strands blocked in. That's the main components for our hair. We can edit these curves more if we want to change where these go. But now we are ready to move on to making some fancier geometry. So the basic plan now is to build some nice geometry and just chuck it into our wrap lattice, and we don't really have to do much else. Throw it in there and then adjust the sizes to be correct with the tweak lattice, or maybe moving wrap lattice and curves. But what geometry do we actually want to use? Now, a lot of that is going to depend on what style of hair you're trying to do. So I'll show a couple different ways you can approach this problem. The one could just be editing our block-in plane. Copy that, have a backup, and of course that goes into our lattice cleanly. But we could do things like grab some of these points and rip them, make a few different strands, do some proportional editing. You get the idea. And then chuck a solidify modifier on it. Find it. And that will give it some thickness. And you do a bit of that. Maybe you throw some subsurf on it. Get some creases where it matters. I don't know, something along those lines. The point is you could flat model some geometry and have that be your hair. And if you're going for simple enough hair, that could work. You could, of course, also go into sculpt mode and sculpt on this, whatever you want to do it. The sculpt mode works on objects with lattices on them. And of course, if we turn that off, we can see that our sculpting happened to the base object. That's also a viable option. But I'm going to show you the way I like to do it. It is appropriate for the style of hair that I like. This method works well for wrapping complex geometry, so I'm going to take the best advantage of that I can. Turn this collection off and enable, here is a previous project's hair. And see, the features of this is that I have very well lined up geometry. The loops are a bit wiggly, but they are all clean loops right down to where these start splitting up. And I have multiple layers of spikes that are offset from each other. But all of these are essentially made from spikes with the geometry lined up. And then for my side curves, it's one big piece that splits into a bunch of shapes. And notice that there's not a whole lot of intersecting, especially if I turn the subsurf on, except on the back here where it didn't matter, so I didn't bother stopping that from intersecting. So I'm going to show you how to make these sorts of clumps with clean topology and clean UVs. We're going to let our block-in shape act as a guide for the bounds of current hair. I'm going to scale it to be as large as the lattice. And remember, if we let it go outside the lattice, it's going to start going flat like that. This is letting me know where the maximum size is before it gets distorted. And of course, I could have the lattice wrap around the back of the head more if I extended it horizontally and readjusted it. So if you want this piece of hair to wrap around all the way to the ears, then that works just fine. Now we'll turn that lattice off. We can leave that hidden. And I'm going to set this to be wireframe and unselectable. Now I should put my cursor to it before I set it to be unselectable. Now I'll be able to line up a new row of spikes along here and then adjust them into proper bundles. So let's look at our options for making spikes. There's lots of ways you can do this. You could start with a curve and convert it if you wanted to use something with like a bevel profile or a cylinder. I'm just going to take a cube down a bunch, a top loop, match my cursor, scale it just on X and Y, but not. Set that to be about the maximum length I'd like. Then let's give it some even loop cuts. That's about enough. We will be using subsurf with this. Then if we scale, before we scale it actually, let's give it unwrap. So I'm going to delete the top and bottom faces. Give it a cut. And seam down the back. And unwrap. Pull up a UV window. You can see that this is laid it out as an cylinder. And depending on what we want our UV wrap to look like in the end, we could leave it like this, but I'm actually going to scale it to fill the whole UV space. And we'll let this UV unwrap. Come back to that later. Now, we're going to try to do the rest of our modeling in ways that don't destroy the UV unwrap. First, let's give it some taper. I'm using proportional editing with sharp fall off, scale, shift Z, so it doesn't scale on the Z axis, then scale to 0. Then we can adjust this to control how much of a spike taper we have. Right? And now, let us add it to our lattice with a lattice modifier. Now we see as we rounded edit mode on X controls what part of the head it's going to be in. So the basic concept now will be to copy and paste these, place them on X, and then adjust their length, of course, and then join them all together at the edges. Before we spend tons of time arranging spikes, let's make sure we fully understand what's going on here. If I move a spike on X, then there's no problems. It stays wrapped around the forehead until we hit the edge of the lattice, and at that point it flies away. If we move it on Z, it's fine until again it hits the edge of the lattice, at which point it gets strange. And if we move it on Y, in and out of the head, and it can even be over other spikes to give some depth. But if we go too far, then it also gets weird. So basically, as long as you're inside the lattice, you're fine, but if you move out, then things get weird. You can, of course, use proportional editing to adjust spike as well. And of course, if we go outside the lattice, then go. But we'll look more at that later. Now let's make these shapes a little bit more interesting. At the moment, all these spikes are rectangles. And of course, scale them on X quite simply to have some fatter ones. And we can also add more loop cuts to them because we haven't joined their tips together. So if we wanted, instead of a rectangle, maybe more of a hexagon, I could add a couple loops there and dissolve this one and slide these around to get the spacing I want. Or we could even remove one of the side loops with dissolve to get a more interesting shape. But I'm not going to do that yet. And of course, we can make them fatter on Y, but I'm not going to touch that quite yet either, and you will see why. That one thinner. And I'm going to try to keep them all the same amount of loops vertically so that they can stay lined up with each other. But before we get into making them more interesting, let's look at how to attach them to each other. The tool we'll be using to join these together is the bridge command. There's a couple different versions of it, as there's a base version and a loop tools version. I don't think it really matters which one you use. What bridge does is it takes two selected faces or sets of faces and joins them together. You have to have the same number of vertices in each selection. And I'm just going to search it on the search bar, bridge edge loops, and watch if you have any twist set. Don't want any. And right now it's creating new faces between these two, which we could use, but I'm going to hit merge. So it's essentially made those faces and then joined the edge loops in the middle. And since I left a bunch of space between these, now I need to move this. Now we have these connected into one strand. And that's the basic methodology we'll use, is create strands, give them slightly different shapes, and then bridge them together. But we can make this a bit more interesting still. Let's get some more depth and shape to this. First, before I go further, I'm going to grab one of my generic spikes, duplicate it, and move it way to the left on X, out of the way, just as a backup, so that if I use all of these, I can copy that and move it back. Now, I'd like these to join together a bit lower down, so we want to bridge these two. You just bridge edges. Yep, that works. Now there's still a face there, so I'm going to delete that face. And then, move these a bit on X. That a bit fatter. And I'm in wireframe mode, so my selection goes all the way through conveniently. Grab that whole side, tighten that up a bit. Now, let's make it a bit more interesting by putting another spike on top. I'll grab this one, duplicate it, and I'm going to merge it with this edge, but this time differently. Because first, I'm going to dissolve this edge, and I'm going to dissolve that edge. And now, when I bridge it, it'll be these two surfaces getting joined. Add in a bit. Now, when making this selection, I have to watch that I'm selecting the right areas. Then I will deselect all the points that we don't want to be bridged, and fire the bridge command again. There you go. Now we have a diagonal bridge instead of a flat one. And of course, it can be easier to work like this, so you can see all your mesh plainly. Now, of course, when we get further in, we can do stuff like add some bridges to this, but I'm going to keep joining spikes before I do that. I'll probably add that detail with sculpting on top later. Now that we've bridged three pieces together in different ways, there's another thing to understand. Pop open a new window and check out what's been happening to those UVs we made. We have three strands worth overlapping each other, which, depending on your texture, may not matter, but notice that these are actually nice and clean. They're missing bits where they were bridged, but they're all still separate chunks and they haven't gotten distorted. And that's no accident. That's because the only commands I've used is moving vertices around, adding or dissolving edge loops, and using the bridge command, and none of those things affect your UVs. Whereas if you do add or delete a points or faces, like if I go in here and say I deleted this, and then I decided I wanted it back, and I made a face, I knifed some stuff into it. Now when we come back and look at our UVs, they're totally screwed up, and they've bridged 2 points together. So if you are manually adding and removing faces, your UVs will get screwed up and you'll have to re-unwrap later, and depending on the complexity of your hair, that might be annoying. It also might not matter. It depends a lot on what you want to do with these UV unwraps. The reason I'm keeping it in a clean grid like this is a lot of hair texturing will be done with a texture, either paint or procedural, that's vertical down the hair. So it's nice to have a very nice, clean, and even unwrap. And if you put a texture down down these UVs right now, then you'll get a tapering to the tip where these points are tapered. So as long as we keep our tools to ones that don't screw up UVs, we basically will have a clean UV unwrap at the end, no matter how much geometry we have, no matter how much bridging or edge loops we do, the UVs will stay clean. So if you do want to do different types, then we'll have to look at different ways to unwrap it again. But we'll get more into that later. Now that we know the basic methodology, let's make it a little bit more interesting. Duplicating my bangs object so I have a backup if I don't like my changes. And now we can introduce some proportional editing on whatever type we like. So we can this to adjust lengths, adjust curves. You can work in flat, or we can come over here and still use our axis locks, X for side, Y for forward and back, work on things. We can bridge more points if we want. Here. Again, remove that internal face. Hard to see here. Flat. Yet. That point. If we want, we can add more edge loops in either direction. Down with edge slide or regular move. And of course, if we want to see a full shaded view, we have to disable the modifier entirely in edit mode. So here we kind of have a choice to make. There's nothing wrong with using proportional edit to say add some different depth to these tips. But keep in mind when you select this, unless you're in wire mode and you select them, you're only getting one of the tip points. So even with proportional editing on, you will gradually offset them. So I do tend to work in wireframe and use C-select. Give that one a back, and let this one cross a bit, back a bit as well. Use bevel to split these instead of adding loop, although there's not any really effective difference. And of course, we can even rotate these a bit just to add a bit more different or contours in there. If I wanted a ridge here, I could add a loop and then maybe to sculpt mode. Nice time to have wireframe on. I could plate and bring this ridge up a bit. That one too. Down. Whatever you like. You could sculpt this with multi-res, pretty much any of the regular modeling tools are available to you. But another way you can do it, if you want to stay non-destructive, is to use hooks. Let's go back to our previous bangs and take a look at what that can look like. Proportional editing is destructive, meaning once you do it, there's no way to undo it. Unless you did it in a shape key, of course, like I showed on the lattice earlier. Isn't a bad idea. But there's another option as well. You could, of course, bone rig these strands and use the rig to arrange them, but the quicker option is to use hooks. make that work, I'll select some vertices, hit Control H, and hook to a new object, and it creates an empty. Shrink that empty down. More. And it's also created this hook modifier, which I'll move above the lattice. Now, if you're not familiar with how hooks work, I do recommend going and looking up another tutorial on it. But the basic idea is they let you attach vertices to an object, and if you use the settings right, you can mimic proportional editing. So currently, if I tab into edit mode, more options appear. But first of all, I'm going to select more of this one spike that I want to be affected, and assign them to the hook. And then I'm going to hit recenter so that the center of the hook is the 3D cursor, which is on the empty. Now when I move the hook, it moves all of them, but it's not quite like proportional editing yet. For that, we need to set some radius. The radius that the assigned vertices will be affected from. I set it to 0.1. Might be too high, because remember this radius is in Blender units, which are like meters. Let's go 0.05. And now we're getting a partial effect. It's sharp. Go a little bit bigger, maybe 0.75. And there we go. Now we're getting a proportional editing-like effect. And we can use that for forward or back and sideways or whatever we want. And since it's on the modifier before the lattice, now get a nice view of what I'm doing. And of course I can map this back to the cursor. Hooks are powerful, but they are a bit tedious to set up, so I do prefer to just manually edit with proportional editing and regularly make duplications of my mesh so that if I don't like what I do, I can just revert. Now let's look at how we can integrate these side clumps with that we set up the curves for. I'm going to grab this extra spike and separate it into a new object. Modifiers. Center. To move the guy over. I'm going to move this curve object, have its origin on that spike. Get rid of this. Now we can assign it curve modifier here. And first of all, it's not long enough. Let's think about how we want to resize this in a way that still works with the rest of what we're doing. See, the reason I put it to the side here is so that we can still easily line it up against these other spikes. What I'm going to do is go ahead and move a bunch of these points back up to the same level as the others, roughly speaking. Then add a couple extra loops. There. I can line these up better later if necessary. They just need to line up most of the way. It doesn't have to be exact. I could use another couple. Now it can go all the way to the top of the head and stays mostly lined up with the depth. That forward on Y. We can down on Z. And if necessary, maybe even scale it on Z towards the 3D cursor. Doesn't have to be exact at this stage. Now, if I intend this to just be a layer that goes underneath the bangs, then I don't need to line the topology up. But if I want it to be on the same layer of the bangs and into them, then I do. And I'll show that just because it's harder to do. But at the moment, these loops don't quite line up. Like ideally that should line up to there and that to there, They don't at the moment. If I scale it a bit, they do a little bit better. That's close enough. Now, of course, I could adjust the curve, and then I could move this back on Y, closer to the head. I want to keep it about the same distance away as the rest. I'll bump this back a bit. I'm not too worried about doing this on the left side as well, because what I'm probably going to do is just work on only the right side and then mirror the left to it. That should be the easiest. Now that we've got our shape blocked in, we can start duplicating our spike, merging and bridging things, and build up a better shape. Before that, we have a little bit of housekeeping, and that's the UVs, which we've been working to preserve. But I went ahead and I added a bunch of loop cuts with no regard to the UVs. And as you can see on the UV map, the cuts are not evenly spaced. And that's because the UV is updated when the cut is made, and it does not update when I move things around. So we have to now re-unwrap this cleanly. Or do we? If we try to do a full re-unwrap, even with our seam there, we will get this, because it's tapered. That's not ideal. Our other option is to use the handy UV squares add-on. There we go. It's now evenly spaced things out again, respecting the spacing in the geometry. Now we just have to rescale it a bit for the window. I think there's also an add-on or a command to scale this to bounds. But now we can get on with modeling our clump. The method for building these side clumps is essentially the same as the bangs, but with a bit more depth. On the bangs, we were only duplicating spikes on x-axis, but for this, we also want to duplicate some on y. Let's lay out a few. And why don't we stagger these back ones a bit? That's a basic layout, and we can turn on our curve modifier to see what it's looking like on the side of our head. Right now I'm leaving the surface of these flat, and I'll add some curvature to the whole clump with a modifier, but depending on the style you're going for, you might want to change their shape so they're not just rectangles. But before we get to that, let's vary the length of these a bit. When you want to change length, you could scale them, but then that messes up the alignment of our loops. So instead of scaling, I'm going to just move them up. Our loops aren't exactly lined up, but it's closer. If I'd kept the spacing even, they would be more lined up, but you won't always manage that, so I've purposely let it be that way so I can show you how to fix it in a minute. Put that there. 2 at that length. Let's delete the extra points. This also helps preserve our UVs. And then I'll grab the 2 in the back, and we can move them up 1 length. And now we can look at how to connect all of these together. Before we start merging things together, let's make a backup copy and make this shape a bit more interesting. I'm going to dissolve a couple of these edges, and let's fix the alignment of these loops. So if you need to quickly align several loops to the same level, we can select, make sure we're on midpoint, do S for scale, Z to lock to Z-axis, and then hit 0. This is one of the big advantages of modeling these things flat. If we had been modeling this around the forehead as curved mesh segments, then it would be very difficult to realign things without a lot of loop sliding. So there's probably a way to, I think that I've seen scripts or add-ons where we could have selected all of these and lined them up in one click or something, but that's the basic way it works. Now we are ready to join them. So that's the same process as we did in the bangs. I'll hide the ones in front to make it a bit easier. Grab these, fire bridge, make sure it's on merge, and Do the same in the front. Make these slightly different heights just to keep it interesting. And if we want, we can even join these two layers together. It's probably not necessary because when it's on the curve, the top layer is covering the bottom just fine. But I'll show you how to do it in case you have a more complicated shape that needs it. First, we've got these extra edges left over. Let's get rid of those. Then we just need to make sure we are selecting an equal number of vertex loops. Get those 3, 4, 5, 3, and then go into wireframe and deselect the lower points so they won't join. Now we can fire bridge, and it's essentially merged those together. Got more extra vertices to get rid of. Now we left some points down here where we could merge a few more of these if we want, and do that too. Like, let's attach that together. Bridge works there, but it leaves an internal face that we have to manually delete. Alright. So now we've got a decent clump, but the overall shape isn't very good. On the bangs, things were automatically tapering towards the top of the head, but on the curve, they're not. There's a few ways we can deal with this. We could, of course, go in here and grab these points, turn on proportional editing, and scale it. But then it's kind of permanent. So let's undo that, actually. We could go into the curve and scale the radius of the curve point with Alt-S, and that will get us to a good taper. But it's down the whole thing a bit more than I like. I could add more curve points, but then that makes it annoying to adjust the position of the curve. And when you scale the radius, it's also affecting the thickness in this direction, which I don't really want. I just want to taper it this way. Let's leave the radius of that point at 1. And instead, we're going to solve this by adding another lattice, just like we did for the bangs. Lattices upon lattices. Scale that down. Fit it to our hair clump approximately. Doesn't have to be exact. Give it some cuts to try to match about the same number that we've got in the hair here. Keep the size consistent. And as before, we'll give it a shape key so that when we make changes, they are temporary. And we'll give this the curve modifier. Chuck our mesh into the lattice. Alright, that's putting it back on the head. And now we'll do our proportional editing on the lattice instead. Now the only downside of this method is even if I turn this on, we can't actually see it on the head at the moment. We kind of have to do this transform blind, so that's not ideal. But it's not too hard to try a bit and check it. Do a little bit more. This is scaling with Shift-Z, so it only scales in X and Y. So let's do Shift and lock it to X. I want a little bit of Y scale, but I want more X than Y scale. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Then we can adjust our curve location a bit, just to line it up a bit better. Give it a bit of tilt there. And the nice thing with the curve is you can set different amounts of tilt at the top and the bottom to get a little bit of twist in it. And there we go. Now that fits in with the bangs a bit better. When we work on the bangs more, we can bring another strand up to here, and eventually we will join these objects together and bridge the edge of the bangs and this. Now that we have the basics laid out, although a bit uniformly, it's time to fill out the rest of these bangs and side strands. So let's dive into a time lapse. But just a couple things left to do. First, we need to merge these pieces together and bridge them. You may have noticed I removed the subsurf, and that's because rather than manually go through and apply modifiers on all of them, I'm just going to do a Control-A, Visual Geometry to Mesh. That just applies all of their modifiers immediately. And I can join them together. I can turn off, hide all of these other curves. If I wanted, I could add lattice modifier and tweak this with the tweak lattice even more, or whatever else. Let's get these joined. Since we already kept our topology lined up, it's nice and easy. Next, let's see how good a job we did of preserving the UVs. Add a material, get rendering. And let's just get a wave texture and make sure everything is going in the proper direction. Of course, wave textures always need a slight rotation in the mapping. And it would help if it's actually using UV coordinates. There we go. All our UVs are going in the same direction. The thickness on the sides is a little bit different, so you might have to scale your side UVs, but for the most part, I only see one place where I screwed something up and the texture isn't clean. I'm sure it's fixable. But this is still most of the way there. That's good enough for me for now. Last but not least, let's see what it looks like rendered. I've chucked the material from my previous project on here, and it seems to look pretty good. Let's kill that rim light. There we go. It's not the best design or layout, but the topology is behaving pretty well. You might want to smooth out some of these areas if we don't want as many visible ridges. And if we pan the light, pretty nice. There's no like weird clipping, there's no like sudden dark areas you normally get from clipping, any of that stuff. And of course, if we run line art on this, it will be clean. There won't be lots of jagged edges that come from all the intersections you get when curve modeling or other methods. Alright, I think that covers pretty much everything. Of course, you're probably going to want to add some hair to the back of your character's head, and for that, it's the exact same concept as the bangs. You'll have to set up another wrapping lattice for the back of the head, and of course, you do it the other way around, and you make it longer, and you might want to add an inner layer. In this one, I use much bigger spikes in the back, because it's less noticeable. If you want to rig your hair, there's lots of ways to do it that I won't really get into detail on here, of course, but the way I'm planning to rig this sort of hair in the future is to use the block-in plane we made at the very beginning, chuck that in the same lattice as the hair, and use that as a rigging mesh with either the surface deform modifier or solidify it into a mesh deform cage, and chuck this hair in that, and then bone rig or maybe cloth sim that simpler mesh. So that will make it much easier to deal with things. So I think that's it for now. Feel free to put questions in the comments or on my Twitter or Facebook, of course. And if you make any hair yourself with this method, send it to me on social media and I'll happy to reshare it. And yeah, like and subscribe, Follow me on social media, all that stuff. Links in the description, and see you next time.